right now, there is a massive fleet of oil tankers sitting completely dead in the water just outside the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
And, they aren't blocked by a physical wall or, like, surrounded by an armada of enemy warships.
No, not at all.
They are paralyzed by a few actuaries in suits in London who simply decided to, well, to cancel their insurance policies.
Right, the paperwork panic.
Exactly. And that paperwork panic happening an ocean away is about to make your local grocery bill double. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are unpacking a geopolitical earthquake that has the entire world basically holding its collective breath. It is late March 2026.
Yep.
And we are exactly 28 days into the rapidly escalating U.S.-Israeli war with Iran.
And we've got a massive stack of sources on the table today.
We really do.
I mean, we're spanning military assessments, humanitarian reports from organizations operating directly in the blast zones, geopolitical white papers, financial analyses.
The sheer volume of data coming out of this conflict is just staggering.
It is,
Yeah.
and it's coming from an incredibly wide array of perspectives. We are looking at statements from the U.S. administration, detailed declarations from Iranian officials, tactical breakdowns from U.S. military veterans, and urgent pleas from international relief workers.
And I want to set a very clear ground rule before we get into the weeds here, because this is important.
Yeah, definitely.
Our mission today is to impartially unpack the facts, the claims, the hardware, and the data presented in these sources without, taking any political sides.
We are not here to endorse any specific viewpoint.
Exactly. Nor are we here to tell you who is in the right or the wrong. The goal is to strip away the spin and just help you understand the profound mechanical realities of this conflict.
Right. We're going to explore how modern warfare actually functions, how the global supply chain is reacting, and how this 28-day-old conflict is systematically reshaping the geopolitical order.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the physical battlefield, because there is a glaring discrepancy between the official narrative being broadcast on television and the tactical reality documented by the military analysts in our sources.
Yeah, it's night and day.
I mean, if you listen to the U.S. administration, specifically President Trump, the messaging is that the war is essentially won.
Right.
The defense secretary has stated that Iran's air force is destroyed, their missile capacity is degraded by 90%, drone capacity degraded by 95%.
And that the U.S. has achieved total air superiority.
Exactly. But the military analysts and veterans evaluating the satellite data and the ground reports, they are painting a fundamentally different picture.
They really are.
Yeah.
The analysts argue that the administration's assessment is falling into this dangerous analytical trap, which they refer to as the World War II paradigm.
The World War II paradigm, what does that mean exactly?
Well, it's the tendency to measure the success of a military campaign using metrics that were relevant in the 20th century but are entirely obsolete today. So during conflicts like the Gulf War or even the invasion of Iraq, the Pentagon measured progress by counting destroyed tanks, cratered runways, pulverized aircraft hangars.
Right, things you can see from the sky.
Exactly. And the current administration is looking at satellite imagery of destroyed surface launchers and older aircraft and concluding that the enemy's capacity to fight has been neutralized.
But the sources say that's a fatal flaw.
It is. The flaw in that logic is that Iran is not fighting a 20th century war. They haven't relied on a traditional air force since the era of the Shah.
Wow.
Yeah. Instead, they've spent the last few decades building a 21st century asymmetric military apparatus.
Which means what in practice?
It means they utilize massive, deeply buried underground complexes in the Zagros Mountains to house precision-guided standoff weapons, ballistic missiles, and drone swarms.
I want to break down what that actually means for the people flying the missions, because air superiority used to mean you could fly your bombers over enemy territory without getting shot down.
Right, allowing you to bomb their factories and bases at will.
But if the enemy's weapons are sitting in reinforced concrete tunnels, like hundreds of feet beneath solid mountain rock...
Dropping a conventional bomb on the surface does absolutely nothing.
Right. You don't need to control the sky if you have thousands of cheap precision-guided weapons launching from fortified bunkers that are practically immune to traditional airstrikes.
Exactly. They simply roll a launcher out of a tunnel, fire a volley of ballistic missiles, and roll the launcher back inside before a U.S. jet can even drop a payload.
That is wild.
And this brings us to the mathematical reality of modern air defense. which the sources highlight as a critical vulnerability here.
Because when those Iranian missiles are launched, the U.S. and Israel have to intercept them,
Right, and this is primarily done using systems like the Patriot missile battery.
which are not simple machines.
Yeah. No, not at all. A Patriot interceptor is an incredible piece of engineering. It's essentially a highly maneuverable, supersonic flying thermos packed with radar seekers, designed to hit a bullet with another bullet in the upper atmosphere.
Wow.
But they are incredibly complex to manufacture. According to the defense analysis in our sources, in just the first 5 days of this conflict,
Just 5 days.
just the first 5 days,
Uh-huh.
the U.S. and Israel expended 800 Patriot interceptor missiles.
Okay, let's put that number into perspective for a second. Imagine an entire massive factory of aerospace engineers, technicians, machinists working around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for an entire year.
Right.
The total output of all that labor, the entire global annual production of Patriot missiles, is roughly 750 to 800 units.
Yeah.
And that entire year's worth of highly specialized multi-million-dollar munitions was vaporized in the sky over the Middle East between a Monday and a Friday.
It's staggering. And the logistical strain is immediate. Because of this extreme burn rate, the U.S. military is now actively scavenging high-altitude air defense systems, including Hejadi and Patriot batteries, from the Asia-Pacific region.
Wait, they're pulling defenses from other parts of the world.
Yes. These are defense networks that were originally earmarked to protect airspace in places like Taiwan, or deployed to assist Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
They're being frantically dismantled, loaded onto cargo planes, and diverted to the Middle East just to patch the holes in the defense net.
But even with these diverted resources, the sheer volume of fire is penetrating the shields, right? Because Israel operates a tiered, highly sophisticated air defense network.
Very sophisticated. You have the Iron Dome for short-range rockets,
Yeah.
David's Sling for medium-range threats, and the Arrow system for high-altitude ballistic missiles.
And despite all those layers, the sources point out that advanced maneuverable Iranian missiles still manage to land directly adjacent to the Dimona nuclear research facility in the Negev desert. And that is widely considered to be the most heavily guarded, restricted airspace in the entire region. If munitions are getting through there, the umbrella is leaking.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And it's not just incoming fire from the east. The sources detail a massive multi-front pressure campaign. Hezbollah, operating out of Lebanon to the north, has launched a major resurgence.
Which is surprising because weren't there earlier assessments suggesting Hezbollah's command structure and military capacity had been decimated?
There were, but the ground reports completely contradict that now. They are inflicting heavy casualties using advanced anti-tank guided missiles.
Really?
Yeah, in one single day of combat, Hezbollah forces reportedly destroyed or disabled up to 21 Israeli Merkava tanks.
21.
In a day, yes. And the Merkava is designed with some of the most advanced active protection systems in the world, specifically built to intercept incoming anti-tank rockets.
But Hezbollah adapted.
Exactly. Using swarm tactics and top attack munitions to overwhelm those defenses. This continuous bombardment has forced the evacuation and displacement of hundreds of thousands of northern Israeli residents.
Which creates immense domestic political pressure on the Israeli government to secure the northern border while simultaneously fighting a massive air war to the east.
Right.
It paints a picture of two completely different styles of fighting. It sounds like one fighter is throwing flashy, expensive knockout punches, flying stealth bombers, dropping specialized bunker-busting munitions, but they are missing, or at least struggling to land a knockout blow on a decentralized subterranean target.
That's a great way to put it.
And the other combatant is just patiently working the body, waiting for the opponent to gas out using a relentless volume of cheaper, easily replaceable drones and missiles.
Waiting for the larger opponent to exhaust their stamina and their wallet.
Right. But I have to ask about the U.S. stockpile, because the sources mention that the U.S. military is relying heavily on exotic munitions. What happens when we actually run out of the high-end hardware?
Well, the analysis from the Royal United Services Institute, which is featured heavily in the geopolitical documents, focuses specifically on weapons like the JASSM, that's the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile.
Okay, what is that?
A JASSM is not a simple gravity bomb. It's essentially a stealthy, low-flying robotic aircraft. A pilot can drop it from hundreds of miles away, completely outside the range of enemy anti-aircraft radar.
Right.
And the missile will autonomously navigate through valleys and terrain to strike a target. They are incredibly effective.
I'm guessing they aren't cheap.
Not at all. They cost millions of dollars each and take a very long time to manufacture. And the U.S. is reportedly running critically low on these standoff weapons.
So if America is burning through a year's supply of interceptors in 5 days, and firing from a safe distance is no longer an option because the military is depleting its inventory of cruise missiles.
The math leaves only one terrifying, fundamentally archaic option.
Right. If you want to stop the missile launches, and you can't do it from the sky, you have to send in the infantry, you have to put boots on the ground.
Exactly. This is where the tactical analysis shifts to the prospect of a U.S. ground invasion.
Wow.
Because air campaigns alone rarely collapse a modern entrenched government or completely neutralize a dispersed missile network. The military veterans contributing to these assessments emphasize that achieving tangible control requires physical occupation.
And the sources are tracking major troop movements, right?
They are.
There are reports of up to 10,000 U.S. troops, including elements of the 82nd Airborne Division and Marine Expeditionary Units mobilizing into the region.
Yes.
But the logistics of this are baffling to me. I mean, 10,000 troops preparing to invade a country of 93 million people. Geographically, Iran is roughly the size of Western Europe.
Right.
It is ringed by massive mountain ranges and harsh deserts. 10,000 light infantry troops cannot conquer a landmass that size.
No, they can't. And the strategic consensus among the military analysts is that a full-scale invasion of mainland Iran is not the objective.
Okay, that makes sense.
Such an operation would require hundreds of thousands of troops, months of logistical buildup, and an appetite for casualties the U.S. public likely just does not have.
So what are they doing?
Instead, the troop movements point toward a strategy of targeted, limited incursions aimed at highly specific strategic choke points.
And the primary target identified in the intelligence analysis is Karg Island, right?
Exactly, Karg Island.
Which is essentially the economic aorta of the Iranian state. It's a small island located in the Persian Gulf, but it houses the terminal infrastructure that handles between 70 and 80% of all of Iran's oil exports.
It's massive.
The crude oil is piped from the mainland fields to the island where it's loaded onto these massive supertankers. So the strategic logic here is pretty straightforward. If U.S. Marines or the 82nd Airborne drop in and physically seize Karg Island, they instantly sever the Iranian government's primary source of global revenue.
That's the idea. And alongside Karg Island, the sources identify several other island chains situated directly in the Strait of Hormuz, specifically Abu Musa, the Greater and Lesser Tums, and Kishim.
Right.
These are heavily militarized islands positioned perfectly at the narrowest bottleneck of the Persian Gulf. Taking control of these islands would theoretically grant the U.S. military physical command over the maritime shipping lanes, allowing them to dictate what enters and exits the Gulf.
That is the theory on a map in a Pentagon briefing room.
Yeah.
But the sources detail the absolute tactical nightmare of attempting to execute this in reality. I mean, let's look at the mechanics of an amphibious or airborne assault in 2026.
It's grim.
The intelligence reports indicate that Iran has established what the military calls persistent surveillance over the entire Gulf region.
Right. And this isn't just radar. This is a network of commercial satellite tracking, automatic identification systems on ships, and constant patrols by cheap, high-endurance drones.
They see everything.
They see every single boat, helicopter, and cargo plane moving in real time. The survivability of a U.S. troop insertion force under those conditions is a primary concern.
How do you even get them there?
Well, to transport Marines onto those islands, the military would likely rely on helicopters and V-22 Ospreys.
Okay.
But to avoid detection by high-altitude, long-range radar systems, these transport aircraft are forced to fly low to the surface, typically under 15,000 feet.
Which makes them a target.
Exactly. Operating beneath 15,000 feet places those slow-moving, troop-heavy aircraft directly into the engagement envelope of Iran's man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS.
Yay.
These are shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missiles that are cheap, abundant, and incredibly lethal to low-flying aircraft.
And even if they make it to the beach, the preparation on the ground is terrifying. The sources indicate Iran is rapidly, heavily fortifying Karg Island and the surrounding coastlines.
Yeah.
They are actively laying advanced anti-personnel and anti-armor mines along the exact beaches where landing craft would have to deploy. They are digging in portable missile defense systems.
It's a fortress.
And here is where the mechanical reality of modern weapons makes this so dangerous. Let's say 10,000 light infantry troops successfully take an island. They are light infantry.
What, they don't have tanks?
Exactly. They do not have massive columns of M1 Abrams tanks rolling off ships behind them. They do not have secure, endless logistical supply chain backing them up. They are sitting on an island just a few miles off the coast of a hostile mainland.
And the analysts pose a very grim logistical question here. How do you sustain that force?
Right.
Like, how do you extract wounded troops or supply water and ammunition when the enemy possesses a massive stockpile of fiber optic suicide drones?
Wait, fiber optic drones?
Yes, a fiber optic drone operates by spooling a literal microscopic thread of glass behind it as it flies.
Are you serious?
I am. This means it does not rely on radio frequencies or GPS to navigate.
Yep.
It cannot be jammed by electronic warfare.
Oh.
The operator on the mainland has a perfectly clear, unjammable, real-time video feed to fly that explosive drone directly into a U.S. defensive position or a supply helicopter from 30 or 40 kilometers away.
That's terrifying.
Attempting to hold a stacked position so close to the mainland against a massive localized counterattack equipped with unjammable precision munitions could result in catastrophic casualty rates.
The military reality of trying to control these islands naturally pulls us into the broader strategic reality of this war, because the waters surrounding these islands are the ultimate prize.
Absolutely.
This is where the physical, kinetic battlefield transforms into a macroeconomic battlefield. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz.
The choke point.
Right. The U.S. administration has repeatedly demanded that Iran reopen the strait. But the economic analyses in our sources highlight a massive misconception about how this waterway is currently functioning.
Because the strait is not physically closed.
Exactly. There is no line of Iranian warships creating an impenetrable wall.
The concept of a blockade has been completely redefined. Iran has effectively transformed the Strait of Hormuz into a selective checkpoint. They are operating it as a geopolitical toll road.
A toll road. That is exactly what it is. The maritime tracking data shows that Iran is actively interdicting, harassing, or blocking ships that are flagged to the U.S., Israel, or their direct military allies.
Yes.
However, they are simultaneously allowing cargo vessels and massive oil tankers from Russia, China, and other non-aligned or friendly nations to sail right through the strait completely unmolested.
It's selective enforcement.
And the catalyst for this wasn't even necessarily a military action. It started in the financial district of London.
Right. The sources detail the critical role of marine insurance, specifically the Lloyd's of London insurance market.
How does that work?
Well, to understand the global supply chain, you have to understand that massive container ships and oil tankers, which can carry cargo valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars, simply do not move without comprehensive insurance. The Joint War Committee in London assesses the risk of global shipping lanes. Once the bombing started and Iranian forces began selectively targeting Western-aligned vessels, the war risk premiums skyrocketed.
So it just became too expensive.
Exactly. The cost to insure a voyage through the Gulf jumped from a fraction of a percent to a level that completely wiped out the profit margins for shipping companies.
Wow.
Once the actuaries panicked and pulled the coverage, Western tanker traffic voluntarily froze. The strait was financially closed to the West before a blockade was even fully realized.
And we always hear about the oil, roughly 20 million barrels of oil a day transit through that choke point, representing about 20% of the global supply.
Right.
But the sources break down the hidden layers of the global supply chain, and it is so much more intricate and fragile than just gasoline. Let's talk about the resources you would never expect to be impacted by a war in the Middle East, like helium.
Yeah, the global helium supply is a perfect example of these unseen macroeconomic shockwaves. Helium is a non-renewable resource, primarily captured as a byproduct during the extraction of natural gas.
Right.
Qatar, sharing the massive South Pars gas field with Iran in the Persian Gulf, is one of the world's largest producers of liquid helium.
And this isn't for party balloons.
No, liquid helium is an absolute necessity for modern medicine. It is the only element capable of cooling the superconducting magnets inside MRI machines down to near absolute zero.
So without it?
Without a continuous supply of liquid helium, every MRI machine in every hospital on the planet eventually boils off its coolant and shuts down.
That is incredible.
The sources report that the collateral damage and strikes in the Gulf have already knocked out roughly 17% of Qatar's liquid helium export capacity. A drone strike in the Persian Gulf directly translates to a delayed cancer screening in Ohio or London.
And the disruption extends heavily into global agriculture, too. The Gulf is a vital exporter of sulfur and, more importantly, urea and raw fertilizers. The production of modern fertilizer relies heavily on the Haber-Bosch process, which requires immense amounts of natural gas. The Middle East dominates this export market.
And the timing couldn't be worse.
Exactly. The sources note that this sudden constriction of fertilizer exports is hitting exactly as the planting season begins in the Northern Hemisphere. If agricultural sectors in Europe, Asia, and the Americas cannot secure fertilizer, crop yields plummet.
A localized war over a waterway threatens to engineer a global food crisis within a single harvest cycle.
When a desalination plant goes offline in Kuwait or a fertilizer shipment is delayed in Qatar, it sounds like a distant regional tragedy.
Yeah.
But when that instability causes the global supply of energy to constrict, the price of diesel jumps 50%. Suddenly, every truck delivering goods to your local grocery store, every cargo plane flying Amazon packages, and every tractor harvesting wheat gets hit with a massive, unavoidable stealth tax.
It hits everyone.
The economic data in the sources shows that in the U.S., gasoline prices have surged nearly 30% in just 28 days, sitting right around $4 a gallon. Jet fuel prices have doubled.
Yep.
The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, is warning that this compounding supply chain shock could drive U.S. inflation up to 4.2%.
And, the United States, as a major domestic producer of oil and natural gas, is actually relatively insulated compared to its allies.
Worry.
Oh, yeah. The sources paint a dire picture for nations wholly dependent on imports. The United Kingdom is reportedly 2 weeks away from entirely exhausting its strategic petroleum reserves.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. And India, one of the fastest growing economies on Earth, is experiencing massive systemic fuel shortages. The crisis has reached a point where the Indian government is actively forcing the shutdown of its domestic plastics and petrochemical industries just to conserve enough petroleum to keep the transportation grid and power plants running.
So, looking at this entire picture, the Iranian strategy described by the analysts becomes incredibly clear.
It does.
They are engaging in asymmetric warfare on a macroeconomic scale. They don't need to build a navy capable of sailing across the Atlantic to threaten the United States.
No, they just need to leverage their geography.
Exactly, to cause so much agonizing economic pain to the global market, driving up the cost of food, crippling industrial production in Asia, and forcing European citizens to pay exorbitant heating bills, that the international community turns on the U.S. and forces Washington to end the war.
It is a strategy of global attrition. However, while the economic pain is distributed globally, the physical devastation is intensely and tragically localized.
Right.
The humanitarian reports in our sources document a profound and accelerating catastrophe within Iran and the immediately surrounding border states.
The human cost of this geopolitical chess game is staggering.
Yeah.
According to the data compiled by NGOs on the ground, nearly 2,000 Iranian civilians have been killed in the first 28 days of the bombing campaign.
Yeah.
25,000 people have been severely injured. And perhaps the most destabilizing figure, an estimated 3.2 million people are now internally displaced.
Over 3 million people.
We are talking about millions of people fleeing major urban centers like Tehran, desperately pouring into rural areas that lack the housing, water, or medical infrastructure to support them.
And the perspective provided by the Norwegian Refugee Council, the NRC, offers a grim window into the reality on the ground.
What are they saying?
Their Secretary General, Jan Egeland, reported that they have 110 aid workers currently operating inside Iran. These aid workers describe a population that is deeply traumatized, enduring continuous multi-wave bombing operations.
Awful.
And the critical issue highlighted by the humanitarian sector is the cascading failure of civilian infrastructure.
Because the military strategy involves targeting anything associated with government authority or logistics, right? So the foundational systems of modern life are collapsing.
Wow.
When a power substation is destroyed to cripple a military communications node, the civilian grid goes down with it. In a sprawling metropolitan area like Tehran, which houses over 10 million people, the loss of electricity means hospital ventilators stop working. Stockpiles of vital vaccines spoil in warm refrigerators. The water filtration and pumping stations fail, and the internet goes dark.
The population is essentially thrown back a century overnight.
Yeah.
The sources also highlight a massive, often overlooked compounding crisis regarding the refugee population already residing within Iran.
Right, the Afghan refugees.
Yes. Iran currently hosts roughly 4.5 million Afghan refugees who fled the collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban takeover. This is one of the largest displaced populations in the world.
And they have nowhere to go.
Exactly. They were already living in precarious socioeconomic conditions, and now they are trapped in the crossfire of an international war with absolutely nowhere else to run. The borders to the east are controlled by the Taliban, and the borders to the west are active conflict zones.
And the humanitarian threat is rapidly spilling over Iran's borders, too. The Gulf states are in a state of sheer panic.
Oh, absolutely.
The Iranian government has explicitly declared that they will retaliate against any neighboring nation that assists the U.S. military, allows its airspace to be used for bombing runs, or hosts U.S. strike aircraft.
And they have already made good on this threat.
They have. The sources confirm that Kuwait's international airport suffered a drone strike that hit its fuel storage tanks, and the United Arab Emirates has reported civilian casualties resulting from the falling debris of intercepted missiles.
The geopolitical analysts point to a terrifying existential vulnerability shared by almost all the Gulf states. Their complete reliance on desalination for drinking water.
Right.
Nations like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait have virtually no major natural rivers or freshwater lakes. Kuwait relies on massive coastal desalination plants for over 90% of its drinking water.
90%.
Yes. Saudi Arabia relies on them for roughly 70%. These reverse osmosis plants are sprawling, fragile, highly exposed industrial facilities sitting right on the coast of the Persian Gulf.
So if Iran, feeling backed into a corner or acting in retaliation for strikes on its own oil infrastructure, decides to launch a coordinated drone swarm against those desalination plants,
The result wouldn't just be an economic crisis, it would be an unmitigated humanitarian disaster.
you would have millions of people living in one of the hottest deserts on Earth suddenly left without a functioning drinking water supply.
It is a literal ticking clock on mass dehydration.
This specific vulnerability leads the analysts and the sources to deeply question the long-term calculus of the military campaign. We hear these military terms like degrading capacity and regime change, but looking at the NGO data, I have to ask, what happens when a country of 93 million people violently collapses?
Right.
Are the strategists ignoring the reality that state collapse in Iran means millions of refugees pouring into Europe and neighboring states? The power vacuum, the heavily armed factional fighting, it would likely dwarf the catastrophic fallout of the Iraq War.
It could permanently destabilize the Middle East for generations.
So with the military and humanitarian situations spiraling out of control, why hasn't diplomacy worked?
Well, the sources indicate that the diplomatic space is currently paralyzed by deep mistrust, maximalist demands, and an unprecedented level of psychological warfare.
If you try to follow the diplomatic developments through public statements, it is completely disorienting.
It really is.
You have the U.S. administration publicly stating that the Iranian military has been obliterated and that their leadership is desperately begging to make a peace deal. Simultaneously, Iranian state media and officials are firmly denying that any direct talks are taking place. They characterize the U.S. claims as clumsy psychological operations, insisting that it is Washington who is frantically sending back-channel messages looking for an off-ramp because they realize they are sinking into an unwinnable quagmire.
And the intelligence assessments confirm that direct, face-to-face negotiations between U.S. and Iranian diplomats are not occurring.
So how are they communicating?
Instead, an incredibly fragile network of back-channel intermediaries is being utilized. Nations that maintain relations with both sides, primarily Oman and Pakistan, are acting as couriers for diplomatic notes.
Right.
The sources also reveal unorthodox back channels on the U.S. side, noting that Steve Witkoff, a prominent real estate investor acting as a special envoy for the U.S. president, has been attempting to initiate dialogue by sending WhatsApp messages directly to Iranian officials.
And according to the reports, the Iranian officials are essentially leaving a U.S. presidential envoy on read. They are ignoring the messages because the fundamental baseline for negotiation trust is entirely non-existent. Let's look at the actual mechanics of the peace plans being floated in these back channels, because they illustrate exactly why diplomacy is deadlocked.
They do.
The U.S. reportedly delivered a 15-point peace plan to Tehran. But when you read the details provided in the sources, it is not a negotiation, it is a demand for total, unconditional capitulation.
Right. The U.S. 15-point plan demands that Iran completely dismantle its deeply buried nuclear enrichment facilities, specifically the sites at Fordo and Isfahan.
Which they would never agree to.
Never. It requires them to permanently cease all uranium enrichment activities, hand over all existing stockpiles of enriched material to international control, and definitively sever all financial and military support for their regional proxy network, including Hezbollah and various militia groups across Iraq and Syria.
So Iran looked at a document demanding the complete dismantling of their primary strategic deterrence and flatly rejected it. In response, they circulated their own five-point counterproposal. The Iranian plan demands that the U.S. pay massive financial reparations for the destruction of Iranian infrastructure during the bombing campaign.
Yep.
It requires binding international guarantees that the U.S. will not initiate future attacks, demands formal recognition of Iranian sovereignty and security control over the Strait of Hormuz, and insists on a comprehensive region-wide ceasefire that explicitly includes an end to hostilities in Gaza and Lebanon.
The diplomatic chasm between a 15-point demand for total surrender and a 5-point demand for regional hegemony and financial reparations is unbridgeable under the current kinetic conditions.
Neither side has achieved the battlefield leverage necessary to force the other to accept such extreme terms.
Exactly. And there is a highly specific, frankly alarming detail buried in the financial analysis section of our sources that complicates these peace rumors even further.
The market manipulation allegations.
Yes. The analysts raised serious allegations that the erratic diplomatic signaling might be tied to deliberate market manipulation.
Which makes sense because the volatility of the oil markets makes them highly susceptible to geopolitical news. The sources document a specific instance where an astonishing $580 million in oil futures were traded in a highly concentrated window.
That's a massive sum.
It is. To explain the mechanics of that briefly, in the futures market, you can place a massive financial bet that the price of oil is going to drop. Just minutes after this massive $580 million position was established, President Trump published a social media post announcing a sudden pause in the bombing campaign, citing imminent peace talks.
Right.
The moment the world thought the bombing was pausing, the price of crude oil plummeted. Whoever placed those trades made an absolute fortune in a matter of hours.
It's incredible.
The financial analysts in the sources suggest the chilling possibility that rumors of peace talks might occasionally be dangled not to achieve a ceasefire, but purely to calm global markets, or more cynically, to exploit them for massive financial gain.
Here's where we connect this to the bigger picture. From the Iranian perspective, the reluctance to engage is rooted in a profound historical trust deficit that was severely exacerbated just weeks prior.
What happened?
The geopolitical timeline in the sources points out that the U.S. and Israel initiated this current massive wave of heavy bombing on February 28th. Crucially, this occurred directly in the middle of a previous active round of diplomatic negotiations.
Oh, wow. So they feel they were ambushed, they were sitting at the negotiating table, and the U.S. used that pause to launch a massive strike.
Exactly. Because of that sequence of events, Iranian military intelligence currently views any new U.S. proposal for a ceasefire or a pause in operations as a deceptive tactical maneuver.
Right.
They believe the U.S. is using the promise of diplomacy as a Trojan horse, designed specifically to convince Iran to temporarily lower its air defense readiness and power down its radar systems, creating a window for the U.S. to launch a devastating surprise attack aimed at decapitating the Iranian leadership.
When the baseline assumption is that the peace treaty is actually a targeting laser, diplomacy cannot physically function.
Exactly.
So the diplomatic channels are completely frozen. The U.S. military is caught in a high-tech war of attrition. The global supply chain is buckling under the pressure of a decentralized blockade. And this unilateral action by the U.S., this war of choice, is having profound structural effects on America's relationships with the rest of the world.
Massive effects.
This brings us to the final and perhaps most consequential section of our analysis today. The massive geopolitical shift. We are watching the post-World War II global order actively fracture in real time.
The conflict in the Persian Gulf is acting as a massive geopolitical catalyst. It is violently accelerating the division of the global economy into distinct competing blocs.
Right.
And the most immediate visible fracture is happening within the core of the Western alliance itself, NATO.
The diplomatic cables referenced in the sources describe a breathtaking breakdown in transatlantic relations. The U.S. essentially approached its European NATO allies and requested that they deploy their naval fleets to the Persian Gulf to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, escort commercial tankers, and enforce freedom of navigation.
And the European response, broadly speaking, was a flat refusal.
They just said no.
They looked at Washington and essentially said, no, this is your war of choice. You sparked this conflict unilaterally without consulting the alliance, and we are not going to sacrifice our ships to bail you out of a strategic blunder.
Wow.
The European perspective is driven by immediate economic survival. Europe does not have the domestic energy buffers that the United States possesses. They are bearing the absolute brunt of the energy crisis triggered by the disruption in the Gulf.
They are feeling it way more than we are.
Exactly. They're facing the very real prospect of physical fuel shortages, crippling industrial shutdowns, soaring, double-digit inflation, and deep economic recession. The EU firmly feels the U.S. recklessly sparked a war that is directly causing Europe's crisis.
The anger is so deep that some allied nations are going far beyond simply refusing to help. The geopolitical analysis reports that Spain is seriously evaluating the possibility of legally expelling U.S. military bases from Spanish sovereign territory.
Which is huge.
Their logic is that hosting U.S. bombers and logistics hubs makes them a legitimate target for asymmetric retaliation, and they want no part of it. That is a foundational crack in the transatlantic security architecture.
It is. And this fracture in the Middle East ties directly into the ongoing, grinding conflict in Eastern Europe. The sources emphasize that the war in Iran is actively cannibalizing the military resources required to sustain Ukraine's defense against Russia.
It comes back to the math of the Patriot missiles and the artillery shells we talked about earlier. Global military production is a zero-sum game right now. If a Patriot missile battery and its highly trained crew are deployed to defend an airbase in Erbil, or a port in Israel, that is a battery that cannot be deployed to protect the power grid in Kyiv.
The diversion of air defense systems, heavy artillery munitions, and vital financial aid from Europe to the Middle East is having immediate kinetic effects. As a direct consequence of the U.S. pivoting its logistical weight to the Gulf, the intelligence reports indicate that the Ukrainian military is experiencing severe munition shortages, allowing Russian armored columns to renew their advances and capture more territory.
The geopolitical reality has become so grim that the sources mention European leaders are quietly, behind closed doors, advising the Ukrainian government not to accept unfavorable peace terms from Moscow right now.
Right.
They are basically telling Kyiv to dig trenches, hold the line, and pray that the political situation in Washington changes because the European Union knows it cannot afford to fund and arm the Ukrainian military alone, while the U.S. is entirely bogged down fighting a multi-front war in the Middle East.
And while the Western alliance is politically fractured and economically bleeding, the macroeconomic analysis points out a profound strategic irony. The BRICS nations, the economic bloc led primarily by Russia and China, are emerging as the primary, uncontested beneficiaries of this conflict.
It is a phenomenal strategic backfire. The U.S. and Europe are currently suffocating under energy shortages and rampant inflation. Meanwhile, Russia and China are absolutely thriving.
They really are.
Because the Gulf oil supply to the West is restricted, India, one of the world's largest energy consumers, is now purchasing double the amount of crude oil from Russia to make up the deficit. This massive influx of Indian capital is flooding Moscow with the cash it needs to entirely bypass Western financial sanctions and fund its own war machine.
And China. China is watching the U.S. burn through its missile stockpiles while safely importing millions of barrels of Iranian oil right through the Strait of Hormuz.
Because Iran is perfectly happy to let Chinese tankers use the toll road for free.
Exactly. The analysts describe this dynamic as a fatal blow to the concept of Western economic hegemony. When the U.S. utilizes the SWIFT banking system and the dominance of the U.S. dollar to sanction nations like Russia and Iran, it relies on the premise that those nations have nowhere else to go.
But this conflict changed that.
It forced the BRICS nations to accelerate the construction of alternative, non-Western supply chains and financial clearinghouses. The war is accelerating the division of the world into two distinct economic and military blocs.
It's like the U.S. set fire to its own front porch to get rid of a wasp nest, and while we're busy fighting the flames, our neighbors across the street are having a barbecue and selling fire extinguishers.
That's a surprisingly accurate analogy. The geopolitical reality detailed in these documents is that the balance of global power is undergoing a seismic shift. This shift is not being dictated by a decisive military defeat on a traditional battlefield. It is being dictated by the grinding realities of macroeconomic attrition, supply chain vulnerability, and increasing diplomatic isolation.
We have covered an immense expanse of territory today, dissecting the anatomy of a massive global crisis. Let's trace the arc of what we've unpacked.
Yeah, let's recap.
We began by peering past the official podium statements to examine the mechanical reality of a 21st century missile war. We saw how overwhelming traditional U.S. air power is struggling to neutralize a deeply buried, decentralized network of precision weapons.
And the threat of ground invasions.
Right, how a theoretical U.S. ground invasion of a choke point like Karg Island faces catastrophic tactical risks from cheap, unjammable drone technology.
We then followed the shockwaves from the kinetic battlefield into the global economy, exploring how Iran has weaponized the Strait of Hormuz.
The global economic chokehold.
Exactly. We looked at the mechanics of marine insurance and saw how a waterway doesn't need a physical blockade to be shut down. It only requires a financial toll road.
We traced how that disruption is choking Western supply chains, driving devastating global inflation, and threatening highly specialized resources like the liquid helium required for medical imaging and the raw fertilizers essential for global agriculture.
And we confronted the devastating humanitarian toll on the ground. Thousands of civilians killed, millions internally displaced, the compounding tragedy of the Afghan refugee population, and the terrifying existential vulnerability of the desalination plants that keep the entire Arabian Peninsula alive.
We examined the diplomatic paralysis, dissecting how back-channel negotiations are suffocated by massive trust deficits, maximalist demands, and the cynical manipulation of global oil markets.
And finally, we zoomed out to see the shifting tectonic plates of the global order. A transatlantic NATO alliance actively fracturing over energy policy, a Ukrainian military starved of resources, and the rapid, unchecked rise of the BRICS nations capitalizing on Western entanglement.
When we synthesize all of this data, it clarifies exactly why this distant conflict is dominating the global agenda.
And why does this matter to you? Because the price you pay at the pump, the cost of the food on your table, and the stability of the global alliances that have defined the last 80 years are all currently tied up in the waters of the Persian Gulf.
They absolutely are. And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to process. Something that builds on the mechanical realities we've explored today. For centuries, global dominance was dictated by the size of your navy and the reach of your air force.
True.
But if a regional power, a nation without a traditional blue-water 20th century navy, without a modern fleet of stealth fighter jets, can effectively hold the entire global economic system hostage, utilizing nothing but geographic positioning and a massive stockpile of cheap, domestically produced precision drones. What does that actually mean for the future of warfare?
It's a huge question.
Does the sheer, overwhelming military size of an aircraft carrier strike group or a fleet of billion-dollar stealth bombers even matter anymore? Or will the next major global conflict simply be one by whichever society has the tolerance to endure the most agonizing economic pain?
It is a question that challenges the foundational doctrines of every major military on Earth.
It forces us to reevaluate everything we thought we knew about power. We like our geopolitical narratives to be clean. We like to look at the map, count the number of tanks, tally the fighter jets, and cleanly declare a victor. But the diagnostic tools of modern geopolitics are irreparably broken.
They really are.
The front lines are no longer confined to trenches. They run through the marine insurance markets in London, the liquid helium facilities in Qatar, and the fertilizer supply chains feeding the globe. The impacts are invisible, immediate, and everywhere. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, always look for the mechanical why behind the political what, and we will see you next time.